Based on what you know, do you have an opinion about Mr. Adelson's guilt or innocence? More specifically, where they get their information, because if they're listening to some podcast that is trying to prove Charlie Adelson's guilt for the last 9 years, that's going to be a strike for cause, regardless of what their answer to number 3 is. What's up, everybody? Couple trials starting this week. One of them is the Charlie Adelson trial, who's been charged with the hit on FSU law professor Dan Markel. Charlie Adelson is Dan Markel's brother-in-law, and this is the 4th trial on the case that is over 9 years old, and it is beginning today. After all these years, one of the main people that most in the media and even in the victim's family think is responsible for Dan Markel's demise. We're going to talk about jury selection today. We're going to talk about what's very interesting in this case, all of the things that make it difficult, how much harder it's going to be than a normal trial like this, how many more jurors they're planning on summoning. We're going to talk about some of the questions they plan to ask the jurors and how it works in a process like has been reported. They're going to do this jury selection, which is one by one behind closed doors. My dad and I did that in a federal criminal jury trial, one by one, behind closed doors. So I'll tell you what that's like in this video. Let me know what you think in the comments. Hit that like button if you are going to follow this trial and if you enjoy this content. So what makes this more difficult than your average case, even a first degree M case like this? What makes this more difficult? Well, there are a number of factors, some of which I mentioned right off the top, right? The case is 9 years old, and this is the 4th trial on these facts. So to bring you up to speed, one of the triggermen was tried and convicted. One of the connecting pieces, which was one of the triggerman's mother of his children and Charlie Adelson, the defendant in this trial's ex-girlfriend, that kind of potentially allegedly connected all of these pieces together for this hit on Dan Markel. She wasn't tried once, but twice, because there was a hung jury, which ended in a mistrial. Then she was tried again and convicted. So that's 2 trials for her, 1 for the triggerman. So that makes this the 4th trial on these facts. And why does it make it harder that this is the 4th trial on these facts? Well, every time this case goes to trial, there are reports on it. Some of them have been live streamed. People have discussed it on the media. And a lot more people have heard about this case than if it was even a high-profile individual first trial on those facts. So 9 years old, obviously the high-profile nature, all the news media reporting coverage of it, and then the fact that this is the 4th trial on these facts. And then we take the victim into account. A high-profile victim, former law professor at FSU College of Law, prominent figure in Tallahassee. People knew who he was. They know who he is now even more. So the victim being somebody that a lot of people are going to have heard of, whether or not there would have been news media coverage in this case. And then the nature of the crime, the heinousness of the crime, makes it difficult to pick a jury for people that have to sit in judgment of somebody that committed the ultimate crime, potentially taking someone's life or ordering the hit to take someone's life. Because generally those juries are harder to pick. So that's at least 5 factors that make this jury more difficult to pick than your average jury. So what do you do to pick a jury in these cases? I've had veneries, so potential jurors come in as small as 34. We have a panel of 34 people to pick 6 jurors plus 2 or 3 alternates, depending on how long our civil case is going to go. In federal court, when we did it behind closed doors, we probably had a little over 100. It was a crazy trial. It was an attempted taking of someone's life, but it was a high profile nature. There had been a bunch of news reports. The target was a major bar in downtown Tampa, but we don't have to get into those facts today. The point was there was a lot of media coverage back in the day. This was 9 years ago, probably this trial happened. And it was mostly like newspaper and written media that was covering the case, and then local news channels, of course. But when we did it, one of the things we had to do was individually question the jurors about how they got the information. Well, so that's one of the ways you deal with and combat all of these elements that make this a more difficult jury to pick. You talk to them individually. so that they're not just being quiet. When I pick a jury as small as 34 people sometimes, and I ask a question and nobody raises their hand, I really got to pry. I really got to continue to talk. I got to get them talking. I got to pick topics that are going to make them talk more. That maybe they're not even answering the ultimate question, but I'm getting a little more information on the ultimate question based on the question and the answer that I'm getting, if that wasn't too confusing. So why do you bring them in individually? So that they have to talk to you. You don't want jurors on a jury like this that didn't say a word and went through the entire jury selection process without raising their hand once, without speaking once, because you know nothing about that juror. And you don't want to create a situation where you have an unfair jury or a partial juror that's already made up the case. They're biased. They've made their decision based on news reportings, based on the fact that there have been 3 other trials that 2 of them ended in conviction, that nobody's walked away not guilty in this case. You don't want that juror on this jury. So the only way to find out a lot of information sometimes is to be able to talk to the jurors individually to make sure you know what information is in their head. What are they thinking? What have they seen? Are they going to be able to just look at the evidence in this case? Why do it behind closed doors? Well, private information potentially. You want the jurors to feel comfortable. You want to be able to have open dialogue, maybe call them by their name, and all that stuff should be protected in a high profile case like this. Again, the high profile nature also makes sense to have this behind closed doors because all of them are going to be talking when it's one-on-one. And so to keep that information private, not have any slip ups, not have anybody accidentally take a picture of somebody, which we've already seen happen in this case is crazy, or not in this case, but in other cases as crazy as it sounds. So that's why to handle it behind closed doors, one by one. Now, some other reports of what they're going to do in this case that is unusual. They have set out 3 days to pick the jury. Now, it took us probably 2 days in that other case I was talking about. Most juries are picked within a half a day or a day. But again, those are sometimes civil trials. Those are only 6 jurors. In this case, they're picking 12 jurors and 3 alternates, so 15 people total. And again, that's because of the nature of the crime and the penalties in this case. So they're picking 15 people. So how many jurors do they bring in for that? How many potential jurors, I should say, do they bring in for that? Well, like I said, in most cases, it's somewhere between 35 and 50 jurors. In high profile, serious cases in federal court, like the one we had, they maybe bring in over 100 jurors. And sometimes when you bust a panel, like sometimes we've picked a jury with 35 people, we weren't able to get a jury, panel's busted, it's a mistrial. We've got to reset the trial and start the whole thing over again a month or 2 from now, sometimes a week, depending on the court's calendar. So you don't want that to happen. So how do you make sure that doesn't happen? Well, in our federal case, we made sure there was 100 jurors. Actually, we ended up picking from jurors that had already been struck from other cases that maybe weren't right for them, but maybe this one was right for them. I never love doing that because they've already been struck in other cases, which makes it less likely for them to be a juror on this case or on any case. It's kind of like when somebody's already sat on a jury before and they came to a verdict, it makes them more likely to be on a jury in this case because they've kind of passed through all the automatic cause challenges and things like that. So planning ahead for the right amount of jurors is important. And as reported in Tallahassee, usually for a case of this high profile and for these crimes, they would bring in about 100 jurors. Well, in this case, they have tagged or are planning on bringing in 300 jurors, almost 3 times the amount normal for these kinds of cases. And it sounds like they're planning on doing about 100 a day. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of this week, they plan to select a jury. So what happens if they pick a jury out of the first 100 people? Then it's done. We go to trial. We've got our jury. But nobody seems to think that's likely to happen. And again, because of those 5 factors, how old the case is, the nature of the crime, the high profile victim, the media coverage, and the fact that 3 other trials have already taken place in this case. So they're bringing 300 jurors. They're going to take 3 days. They're going to take their time, make sure they get the right jury. They're going to question them individually and behind closed doors. Now, some of the reported questions that they're going to ask these jurors. And this is what the court is planning on asking. So this is kind of the initial questions, and then the lawyers will be able to ask their more specific questions individually. But the judge plans to ask, what do you know about this case? Very vague. A lot of people might say nothing if they were in a big group of 30 or 50 people. But when you're individually being asked this question, you have to answer this question. And it may seem like a obvious question or a dumb question or why are they even asking it? They're going to have to tell the court in court under oath, telling the truth, everything they know about this case. The judge is also going to ask, what sources have you obtained this knowledge from? Have you been watching YouTube? Have you been watching local news? Have you been looking up articles? Have you been listening to podcasts about this case? People are going to have to answer that question. And this is really interesting research. And I'd be interested to talk to some of these lawyers after the case about what these answers were, if the judge allows them, not necessarily to be public, but to be shared so we can learn how are people consuming media. Are most people still finding it in Tallahassee from the local news that are there potentially called to be on this jury? Or are they seeking out podcasts because they know this happened in their backyard and they're very interested, or they knew the victim or they heard of the victim, or they knew somebody that went to FSU College of Law and had Dan Markel as a professor? A lot of us out there, especially in Florida, especially in Tallahassee. And then the third and ultimate question that's been reported the judge is going to ask is, based on what you know, do you have an opinion about Mr. Adelson's guilt or innocence? So they're going to have to tell the court, they're going to have to tell the lawyers what they know about the case, which can be very broad, more specifically where they get their information. Because if they're listening to some podcast that is trying to prove Charlie Adelson's guilt for the last 9 years, that's going to be a strike for cause, regardless of what their answer to number 3 is, probably. But number 3, they're going to have to tell the court, what is your opinion? Now, that's the hardest question. That's the easiest question to waver on. That's the easiest question to say, I can be fair and impartial. I don't have any opinions about his guilt or innocence. But again, if I'm a defense attorney and they listen to this podcast that all they tried to do was prove Charlie Adelson did it, or that the Adelson family was involved, there's no way they're getting on this jury. So that's going to be something interesting in this case to see what these jurors or potential jurors have been listening to. What have they been watching? What do they know about this case? And what are their feelings before this trial ever starts? And that's why we talk about on this channel, if you're ever going to be a juror, you got to walk in with no preconceived notions, regardless of what you've seen, watched, or heard. Be prepared to make a decision based on the evidence, even if it's different than what somebody reported or what you saw otherwise. We have seen in this case, and we know it is a fact, that there can be misreporting purposely, but also just negligently or accidentally, or just reporting things that people allegedly said or did or found. But what comes in court is reliable and is admissible, and that's all you can consider. So this is not something I want to preach to potential jurors while I'm picking them. This is something we need to talk about now as a society, as a YouTube channel, as a community. We need to be those kinds of people. So if we are called upon to be jurors, we are ready when we walk in there. And we're not trying to just totally change the way we think or believe while we're sitting there about to be asked the ultimate question in someone's life. So 300 jurors over 3 days to pick 15 jurors for a high-profile case that's 9 years old. Similar facts been tried 3 times. This is one of the more difficult juries to pick. Think about Murdoch. Think about Rittenhouse. Think about Johnny Depp. They all had the high-profile nature. A lot of them more high-profile than Dan Markel's case. But these other elements, none of those cases, as far as I know, I don't remember how old Johnny Depp's case was now, but I don't think any of those cases were over 9 years old. I'm positive none of those cases had 3 other trials in the same jurisdiction, right? We know Depp had the UK trial, but in the same jurisdiction, 3 trials, similar facts, high profile nature, 9 years old. And that's why this case is taking precautions that none of those other cases took. Individual questioning behind closed doors, 300 jurors over 3 days. Now, some of them took days. Some of them had probably even more than 300 jurors, I think, for Murdoch. But all of these elements combined, this is going to be a very laborious and interesting jury selection. But I think we can have confidence that at the end of the day, they're going to pick a fair and impartial jury that is right for this case. Let me know what you think in the comments. We'll continue to follow this case. We'll provide updates if we hear juror questions or issues with the jury, or if there's a mistrial because they bust a jury panel or something happens. We will follow it up, but let me know your comments and we will continue to follow this case as you guys requested. Thanks for being here. Until next time, I am out of here. Thanks for watching another episode of The Lawyer You Know. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit the thumbs up and share with your friends who might be interested here on YouTube. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. You can also follow us on all social media, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, at Lawyer You Know. But on Instagram, we are still at Tragos Law. So look us up on there. And don't forget to listen to the Lawyer You Know podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you have a case you want to talk to us about, if it's a personal injury case, wrongful death, catastrophic injury, car accident, or slip and fall case, please email us lawyeryouKnow@gmail.com. Of course, all of these links I just mentioned are included in the description below on this episode and every episode. So until next time, this is Peter Tragos, the Lawyer You Know.